Greetings and salutations, everyone. I'm Tyrell Ventura. Coming up on Buzzsaw, we're digging into the JFK assassinations and Lyndon Baines Johnson's involvement in it. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us. Joining me today is Roger Stone, a man who's got over 40 years experience in inside the Beltway politics in Washington. He's worked for Nixon. He's helped manage the campaign of Gary Johnson. And today he's got a new book out called The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. We're going to find out the evidence that he's put forth in this book. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today, Roger.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been, this is a fascinating book and a fascinating subject matter. What, you've spent 40 plus years as a political insider. What inspired you to write, to kind of investigate LBJ's involvement?
The claims of the Warren Commission never seemed credible to me from the beginning. In 1964, I read a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. I was a preteen volunteer in the Goldwater campaign. And the book outlined a pattern of criminal conduct and murder by Lyndon Johnson in his pre-presidential years. I believe, and I say in my book, he's responsible for at least 8 murders. Murders to cover up corruption, epic corruption, murders to cover up vote theft and electoral fraud. So murder is in his DNA, murder is in his repertoire. Therefore, it's not surprising that in November of 1963, when he is facing political ruin, he is actually facing the end of the trail, because he knows that Robert Kennedy wants him off the 1964 ticket. He knows that the U.S. Senate is investigating him in the Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was his right-hand man, his bag man in the Senate, Secretary of the U.S. Senate, taking millions in bribes on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. He also knows that Robert Kennedy has given Time Life a dossier regarding Lyndon Johnson and his business dealings with a man named Billy Sol Estes, who is a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer who's been kicking back millions to Johnson. So time is running out for Lyndon Johnson. He's a desperate man. He isn't just facing political ruin, he's facing prosecution and jail. And he knows that Life magazine has their expose on him scheduled for December 1st. So the clock is running out.
And so obviously, yes, if he then becomes president, he can put a kind of a squash on all of this.
And that's exactly what happens. As soon as he is elevated to the presidency, the Baker hearings in the United States Senate are terminated. The Justice Department investigation into Lyndon Johnson is terminated. Billy Sol Estes doesn't rat Johnson out. He goes to jail, as does Baker. But no one points a finger at LBJ because he's the president of the United States.
So do you feel that he hatched the plot himself, or do you feel that he, when he got wind of the idea of killing Kennedy, he became a very avid participant?
I think he's the linchpin of the plot. In other words, it's not very hard if you're a Lyndon Johnson to look at all the others who have an interest in the removal of JFK. First of all, I think it's important to note that if you look at all the others who I think are part of this plot, the CIA, organized crime, Big Texas Oil, Johnson has a unique relationship with each one of them. Johnson is on the committee that oversees the CIA. Johnson has approved their black box budgets in the 1950s and 60s. Johnson has helped fund the CIA. When he leaves the Senate, his ally, Senator Harry Byrd from Virginia, becomes the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee overseeing the CIA and their budgets. Johnson has a unique relationship with organized crime. We now know that Johnson is being paid $55,000 a month in a bribe, which is huge monies in 1963, to protect the illegal gambling operations in Texas of mobster Carlos Marcello, who operates the Texas and Louisiana mobs out of New Orleans. And then, of course, there's big oil. Lyndon Johnson is the water carrier for the oil depletion allowance, which JFK wants to do away with. We're talking about millions in new taxes and higher taxes for his wealthy right-wing oil buddies in Dallas. So he has a unique relationship with everyone else involved in the plot, and therefore it's not hard for him to find co-conspirators.
Mm-hmm. There's also obviously the case as well, in terms of like the military-industrial complex and things like that. And, Kennedy was looking to kind of not go into Vietnam. I think there's
Johnson
a lot of
is the appropriator for the military-industrial complex. No defense contract gets let in the United States in the 1950s and 60s without a bribe to Lyndon Johnson. His aide, Don Reynolds, testifies to the U.S. Senate there were suitcases of money coming in and out of his office. We have the best example of this just prior to the investigation. Johnson wires a $5.6 billion contract for General Dynamics in Fort Worth The Secretary of the Air Force is forced to resign over the fact that Johnson delivered this contract. So he is the appropriator for the military-industrial complex. There is nobody closer to the Pentagon boys or the CIA.
Do you think that Kennedy got any wind of this ahead of time? You know, I mean, if he has kind of all of these people, you know, conspiring and talking and things like that, and his right hypothetical, you know, his vice president, you know.
We know for a fact that JFK tells his secretary Evelyn Lincoln on the eve of leaving for Dallas that Johnson will be dumped from the ticket. He knows that because of the Baker scandal and the Sol Estes scandal, that Johnson has become a giant liability. There can be no question that JFK knows that the CIA is unhappy with him over the Bay of Pigs, but from his point of view, he's the chief executive. They should be more upset that he's upset with them. Indeed, he's prepared legislation to defang the CIA. He has signed documents that start the withdrawal of our men from Vietnam with an eye towards having them all withdrawn by 1958. He has vetoed Operations Northwoods, which is a plan by the CIA to go out and kill Americans, try to make it look like the Cubans did it as a provocation to invade. And then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the American people are told that John F. Kennedy faced down the Russians and made them blink, but 30 years later we find out that Jack and Bobby traded away our strategically placed missiles in Italy and Turkey, changing the balance of power in the Western theater. But no one told us that at the time. So the Russians, they made a good deal. They came out on top in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I don't think he understands the enormity. And we now know, of course, it's Lyndon Johnson who insists that he visit Texas. It is Lyndon Johnson and his associate, Governor John Connally, who insist on the drive through Dealey Plaza. In fact, Connally tells the chief advance man for President Kennedy, if he doesn't want to do it our way, tell him the invitation is rescinded and we don't want him. Wow. Now, I've worked for 4 American presidents and I've elected a number of governors. Governors don't talk to presidents that way. It doesn't happen that way.
Yeah, that's incredible. Look, let's talk about a little bit. I think it was also interesting to get into Johnson's actions after the assassination. I mean, we've all heard the stories of him having the limousine washed and refurbished. And I mean, when you look at his actions afterwards, they seem like the actions of a guilty man, or at least trying to cover up a crime.
Yeah, I think you have to look at Johnson's activities before, during, and after the assassination. Before the assassination, he blackmails his way onto this ticket. In 1960, John Kennedy already decided on Stuart Symington to be his running mate. He's asked Symington, and Symington's accepted. Symington's in his hotel room writing his acceptance speech. Lyndon Johnson shows up late at John Kennedy's hotel room. He has with him a dossier on Kennedy's sex life, courtesy of J. Edgar Hoover and his famous secret files. Johnson and Hoover were very close. They were next door neighbors. Johnson has delivered all of Hoover's budgets in the United States Senate. Hoover likes power. He likes money. The CIA has expanded exponentially during the times that Johnson is controlling the purse strings. And Hoover is looking at mandatory retirement. He knows the Kennedys are going to put him out to pasture. So Johnson basically says to Kennedy, you need me on the ticket, and if you won't take me on the ticket, I'll give this dossier and I'll just go over and give it to Dick Nixon. And you can worry about it in the fall. So Kennedy folds. They asked Johnson the next day, why would you step down from one of the most powerful positions in the federal government, Senate Majority Leader, for a powerless position? And he says, I've looked at the odds. There's a 1 in 4 chance of Kennedy dying and my becoming president. So he's very candid about why he takes the vice presidency.
Wow. Wow.
He is insistent on going to Dallas, as we discussed. And then on the actual day, as his car, 3 car lengths behind the president's limousine, pulls into Dealey Plaza, but before the first shot is fired, he hits the deck. He's on the floor. He's huddled around a walkie-talkie.
Really?
Now, how do we know that? There's an actual photograph where you can see Lady Bird waving to the crowd. You can see Senator Ralph Yarborough waving to the crowd, but there's no Johnson. That's because he's on the floor of the car. He later gets a Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, to say, falsely, when I heard the first shot, I shoved Johnson to the floor. That is completely false. We know that because the timing of the photograph is known. So there's photographic evidence that Johnson ducks before anything even happens. And what is he listening for on the walkie-talkie?
Right.
The word that the big event has happened?
The big event has happened, which is the big event is interesting because when I was working on conspiracy theory, just even with my father, we'd interviewed E. Howard Hunt's son, And he had the audio confession of E. Howard Hunt referring to the big event.
Which is interesting because that's also what Ed Clark, who was Johnson's personal attorney and the man I believe was the actual campaign manager, as it were, project manager of the assassination, he referred to it as the big event.
It's interesting.
I think all of the plotters referred to it as the big event.
That's very interesting. So let's get into what Johnson did. It's interesting, you had talked, I believe, about, who he got to remove the bubble top as well.
Yeah, I always found this curious. Bill Moyers, now with PBS, a man who refuses to be interviewed on this subject by anyone. He goes to the Secret Service and he says, the president wants this goddamn bubble top off now. But the problem, of course, is that two Kennedy aides, Ken O'Donnell and Jerry Bruno, both testify for the Warren Commission that the president never gave any such order. And Moyers, an ordained Episcopal minister, a theological student, that doesn't sound like his language. He sounds like he's paraphrasing his boss, Lyndon Johnson. Get that goddamn bubble top off. Now, the bubble top was not bulletproof, but it was opaque. It wasn't, you couldn't see through it. Therefore, there was no way to get a clear headshot, which is why it was crucial for the bubble top to be removed. So Bill Moyers has blood on his hands, and he should answer these questions.
Do you think that he knew about it ahead of time, or do you think he was a pawn in the game?
I suspect he was just a pawn of Lyndon Johnson. Look, he himself is quoted as saying that Johnson was a very, very sick man. It was, the personality of Lyndon Johnson was concealed from the American people. He was a ruthless, corrupt, vindictive, unbalanced, vicious, abusive, crude, vulgar. This is a man who fathered 3 illegitimate children while president of the United States. A man who is having sexual relationships with at least 5 women in the White House staff. This is someone who is usually drunk. This burnished image that the LBJ library cranks out, Lyndon Johnson was an amoral psychopath. And those who worked for him knew it. George Reedy, his own press secretary, said he was an animal. He likened him to Stalin and Hitler. Wow. Moyers said he was a very sick man. Bobby Kennedy said he was an animal. Richard Nixon said he was a wild animal. This is someone who I think the American people have lost sight of how evil and how corrupt and how completely devious he was.
Well, you've also talked a little bit about Jackie Kennedy's response to all of this, and could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't believe Jackie Kennedy. She writes in a letter, I never liked Lyndon Johnson and I never trusted him, which is in my books. First time the letter I think has ever been reported. She also asks French intelligence, since she can't get the time of day from American intelligence, and because she's she's the toast of Paris, she's a bourgeois, she's fluent. She asks friends in French intelligence who killed my husband. So they conduct their own investigation, and they determine it is Lyndon Johnson. We know from a declassified document, declassified in 1992, a memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the president, that the KGB has conducted their own investigation, exhaustive investigation. They have also concluded that it's Lyndon Johnson.
Wow.
Jack Ruby, who's never allowed to talk to the press prior to his conviction, but who is going down a hallway. You can see this on YouTube. He's wearing in handcuffs. He's being pulled down a hallway. Reporter shouts out, "Jack, how could this happen?" Ruby says, "This never would have happened if Adlai Stevenson had been vice president." Wow. They say, "Jack, what are you saying?" Ruby says, "Look at the man at the top, the man who's in there now, the man at the very top." He's talking about Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to pull off an assassination, and let's call it for what it probably is, a coup d'etat.
It is a coup d'etat.
You need to have, obviously, Lyndon there, and especially when, like as you're saying, Lyndon was such an advocate for it and was fighting for it, given all the pressures that he had,
Well, and he was in a hurry because time was running out.
Yes.
He was facing federal prison. I think it was. I think Oliver Stone's movie put it best. They said Lyndon Johnson was waiting in the wings for the military-industrial complex.
Well, it's interesting. Let's get into what I always found interesting as well as another kind of smoking gun. You always look at actions, and Lyndon appointed the Warren Commission,
right?
And they came up with Oswald and all of this, and they kind of built this case towards Oswald. Everything pointed to Oswald. How do you think? Do you believe that they knew that a conspiracy took place, or were they?
Actually, I think not. I think Johnson. We know from Earl Warren's memoirs that Johnson gets Warren to chair the commission by saying, "Look, the Russians did this. The Russians and the Cubans. We have to cover it up for the American people because it will mean World War III. It would mean 30 million dead in a nuclear holocaust. Do this for your country. You must do this for peace and your country. I think all of those men have been conned into believing that they are doing it to cover up a greater evil. We have the telephone tapes of Senator Richard Russell. On the day that they signed the final report, he says to Johnson, "I don't believe a word of it." And Johnson says, "Either do I."
Wow, wow. I mean, but you also had like people like Alan Dulles on the commission too, who was fired by Kennedy. So I mean, he clearly
this is hysterical. Alan Dulles is very bitter about being fired. Kennedy blames him for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. So in a certain sense, appointing Dulles is an FU to the Kennedy family.
Yeah.
And then Johnson says later that he appointed Dulles to the commission at the request of Robert Kennedy. The problem is that when Johnson says this, Robert Kennedy is already dead. That's because it is a lie. And it's interesting, the only guy in the Warren Commission who doesn't have a full-time job and therefore spends most of his time steering the cover-up is Alan Dulles. Everybody else on the commission has a full-time job. Even the senior lawyers all have a full-time job with their fancy law firms, which is why you have junior lawyers like Arlen Specter and David Bellin dreaming up the completely cockamamie single bullet theory.
Well, it's interesting, when I was reading your bio, you'd actually worked with Arlen.
I did. I knew him very, very well, and we fought like a cat and a dog over this, usually over cocktails. Look,
Really?
He was a very smart, very aggressive, very abrasive establishment guy who was very ambitious. And he is doing the establishment's bidding. He's doing what Earl Warren and Alan Dulles tell him to, and it's not hard because, as you know, J. Edgar Hoover wraps up his investigation in 3 days. And he hands it to the Warren Commission and says, "Here, boys, rubber stamp this."
Here you go. Yeah.
And in fact, they do. The problem is, just before they're about to rubber stamp his conclusion, 3 bullets, all shot from the back, Oswald is a communist, which is a total fabrication.
Yeah.
They have one minor problem, and that is Jim Tague pops up, and he's a car salesman. He's in Dealey Plaza that day. And a bullet hits the curb next to him, and a fragment of bullet or a fragment of cement pops up and scratches his face. Well, now the government has a problem. There's another bullet.
Yeah.
So they were saying, well, the first bullet hit Kennedy, then the second bullet hit Connally, then the third bullet hit Kennedy.
It was a headshot.
Now they can't say that anymore because they've got a 4th bullet, and there's proof of the 4th bullet. So now Specter is forced to invent the so-called single bullet theory, which would be the first time in the history of the world that a bullet has actually changed directions 3 times.
3 times.
And remained pristine.
Yeah. Very little damage on this bullet that went through, a wrist, ribs, throat, all of this. It's insane. It's insane. Anybody knows. It's interesting. Well, and then they also have the Zapruder film too, that kind of documented the whole thing.
Yeah, actually, Specter was forced to admit that there are frames missing from the Zapruder film. I learned in the course of writing this book, after Arlen Specter was already deceased, of his badgering witnesses, threatening to send one witness, Jean Hill, who insists she heard 4 shots. He says, "Do you realize I can have you put in a mental institution?" So he's a bully, and he's doing the establishment's bidding.
Right. Because they're under the fear of that the Russians did this, and it's World War III.
We have to cover it up. So even Arlen Specter thinks he is working for notable purposes. He doesn't understand he's covering up a criminal conspiracy that involves the president, Lyndon Johnson, the agency, the mob, Texas Oil. He doesn't realize that that's what he's covering up. He thinks he's covering up the Soviets.
Well, it gets into that element that we always get asked. How can you keep a conspiracy running through all of these people?
Well, of the 1,000 people tangentially involved with this race, over 100 of them die mysteriously. Or, pardon me, a majority of the 100 die mysteriously.
Yeah.
That's how, by silencing witnesses who come forward and say things that don't fit the Warren Commission's narrative, the Arlen Specter narrative. So woe be unto you if you say, you saw a man shooting on the grassy knoll. 51 witnesses say they saw a puff of smoke, a flash of light, commotion on the grassy knoll. None of their testimony makes the Warren Commission report.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, where does Oswald fit into all of this?
Well, first of all, I think you got to start with who is the shooter, or who is at least one of the shooters.
Yes.
I think that the shooter from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository is a man named Malcolm Mack Wallace.
Okay.
He is the personal hitman of Lyndon Johnson. He has worked for Lyndon Johnson since the 50s. I believe that he is responsible for the death of John Kinzer, who was blackmailing Johnson, who was involved with Johnson's sister intimately. Johnson's sister was a very flamboyant, bohemian, bisexual party girl, and sometime prostitute.
Not a good person to have when running for higher office.
Right,
in the
and she
family.
was a constant embarrassment to Johnson. Wallace killed Kinzer. He went to trial. First of all, when he was apprehended, according to the affidavit of the arresting officer, he says, "You can't arrest me, I work for Senator Johnson, and I have to get back to Washington." He's indicted for first-degree murder. He goes to trial. He is defended by John Cofer, Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney. He's the only, every other person convicted of first-degree murder that year, 1951 in Texas, gets the electric chair. But not Malcolm Wallace. He gets convicted and he gets a 5-year suspended sentence.
Wow.
Where he immediately goes to work. I mean, within days at Temco, which is a defense contractor owned by a man named H.D. Bird, one of Lyndon Johnson's closest friends, biggest financial backers, and the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building.
Wow.
So Johnson has motive, he has means, and he creates the opportunity. Why do we know it's Wallace? Here's why. Wallace leaves a fingerprint in the sniper's nest. There's only 5 prints that don't belong to the Dallas Police Department or some employee of the building. 4 of them belong to Oswald, I suspect, planted there. But there's one 34-point match print for Malcolm Wallace.
Wow.
Which is admissible in a court of law. We also know now that at least 6 witnesses who were ignored by the Warren Commission say that prior to the assassination, they saw into the 6th floor and they saw more than 2 people, and they saw a man who was heavy-set, balding, with horn-rimmed glasses. You have just described Malcolm Wallace.
Malcolm Wallace. Wow. Wow, that's incredible. That's really incredible.
Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other shooters. I believe there are. I think there's a team of shooters on the grassy knoll. I think there's conceivably a team of shooters in the Dow Tex building next to the school book depository building. There may even be a shooter in the sewer grate. It is clear that the president is shot from the front and the back.
Yeah.
The government goes through ridiculous gyrations with the autopsy photos. The Warren Commission makes their decisions without having ever seen x-rays or autopsy photos. They're given hand-drawn artists' renderings of the president's wound. If that doesn't scream cover-up, I don't know what does.
Well, and they also, let's say, illegally took the body from Parkland and moved it to Bethesda, where then you have surgeons operating under, military surgeons operating under military orders.
Yeah, we know that the doctors in Parkland describe a wound in the back of Kennedy's head. We know that the x-rays and autopsy photos that ultimately surface show the back of his head intact. Those are obvious forgeries. No, the government goes to great gyrations to try to hide the fact that the president has been hit at a minimum from the front and the back, and perhaps even from the side.
Now, you'd also talked about Gerald Ford's involvement with that autopsy and kind of manipulating things in there.
Yeah, I think Ford, working on the behest of Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, purposely alters the autopsy photographs. We know this from a document that was declassified in 1992. We also know that in the memoirs of Deke DeLoach, who was the number 3 man in the FBI, and the memoirs of William Sullivan, who was the number 2 man, that Ford was, first of all, an informant for Hoover on the Warren Commission. So he's letting Hoover know what happens at every meeting. And then DeLoach says, well, we have a problem. What's the problem? Well, we're having a hard time selling the 3-bullet theory and the magic bullet theory to a number of the commission members because we're being asked how a bullet in his upper back could conceivably exit from the front of his throat. So Gerald Ford, in his own handwriting with a pencil, alters the autopsy record to move a wound from the upper left back, even with the 3rd thoracic vertebrae, according to the president's doctor, to his lower neck to try to accommodate the fiction that the wound on the front of the president's throat is an exit wound, when I think we recognize today it's an entrance wound.
But now you'll get like Gerald Posner and Vincent Bugliosi saying, oh no, his coat was just bunched up and that's why I did.
That's actually been completely disproved by the photos. There's no evidence that his coat has been bunched up, but let's put that aside. Admiral George Bunkley signed the death certificate, and he says the wound is 3 inches from the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. Are we saying that this Navy admiral physician was lying? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either. What also is fascinating too is, we're listing off all these kind of names in history and modern political history, and one of them that pops up is George H.W. Bush. And you make a very, he, like you said, is for 20 years couldn't remember where he was.
Almost 30 years.
Yeah, and then he was also associated with George de Mohrenscheld, who was then also associated with Oswald. Could you kind of walk us through his?
Yeah, it's very. I make no accusation against Bush because I really can't quite figure out what he's doing there, and I have no proof. I know a lot of JFK researchers want to say, well, he played a central role. We don't know that, but we do know is that for 30 years he said he didn't know where he was that day, which is absurd because everybody knows
every adult
knows they were that day. Yeah. Then a document is declassified in the 90s, ironically on the basis of legislation that Bush himself signs, although I think reluctantly, that shows that only minutes after the president is shot, he calls the FBI bureau in Houston essentially to establish an alibi. Well, it's 1:45 here. I'm here in Tyler, Texas. And I wanted to tell you that I have heard about a guy named James Parrott in Houston who other people have told me may have made threats against the president. I don't have no firsthand knowledge. It may be nothing, but I just thought I would report it. In fact, when the FBI rushes to find Mr. Parrott, he's in his garage painting George Bush for U.S. Senate posters. So he's just a fall guy, and he's not charged because he hasn't done anything wrong. So for some reason, Bush goes out of his way to create an alibi. He also lies in that call. He says that he is going to return to Dallas that night and can be found there, when in fact he flies on to Houston that night. That's curious. And he never mentions that he was in Dallas the night before, staying at the Sheraton Hotel. In that same trove of documents, we get another document from J. Edgar Hoover, written the day after President Kennedy's assassination, in which he directs underlings at the FBI to brief George Bush of the CIA. Well, George Bush says in his Senate confirmation hearings in the 70s that he never worked for the CIA, which I think is perjury.
Yes.
So I don't know what George Bush is doing in Dallas, but I know that he goes out of his way to dissemble, and I find that curious.
It's very curious.
Anyone would have to find it curious that four men who would be president are in Dallas that day. Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Bush. And then another man who would be president, Gerald Ford, helps cover up the crime.
Helps cover up the crime.
5 presidents.
That's
very
incredible.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
The odds against it are extraordinary.
Well, one of the guys who's put out a recent book on it is Bill O'Reilly.
Yes.
What do you think of his book?
He's just wrong. I mean, first of all, I don't think Bill O'Reilly wrote his book. I'm not sure Bill O'Reilly has read his book. Bill O'Reilly, and by the way, the book is really good. If you want to know about Kennedy's sex life, it's very racy. I mean,
it's a wonderful expose.
It's extraordinary how many women Jack Kennedy is getting with in O'Reilly's book. So it's very purient, and he does accurately tell you how desperate Johnson was. He tells you what I have, that Johnson's about to be prosecuted, that Johnson is desperate, but he won't pull the trigger. He won't connect all the dots. And then to finally, in the final analysis, conclude that Oswald did it, it's kind of a letdown. It's a disappointment, because through 2/3 of the way through his book, he's making the case to blow apart the Warren Commission, and then he folds in like everybody else.
And I bring up O'Reilly just to kind of talk about the modern media today and why they still, even today, refuse to acknowledge that there was anything suspicious about Kennedy's death beyond the lone angry, not Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, you can understand it at the time. In 1963, there's only 3 television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. So if they don't say it, it didn't happen. They have a monopoly on communications, electronic communications. You have only 2 or 3 major national newspapers, the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune. So, and we have documents from the CIA that talk about their efforts to manipulate the media to satisfy the public curiosity about who killed Kennedy. And it was very easy to perpetrate a cover-up in 1963. Thank God for the internet and for shows like this one. It's no longer possible to control all the information, and therefore it shows us why a majority of the American people continue to tell the Gallup poll that they don't believe the government's version of the Kennedy assassination. They believe there was a conspiracy. They don't believe Oswald acted alone, if Oswald acted at all. Personally, I believe Oswald is on the 2nd floor eating his lunch, just like he says he is. I don't think he's even on the 6th floor. I also, the idea of Mr. Posner and Mr. Bugliosi that he ran down the stairs, really? Why is he not out of breath? Why is he not upset? Why does he not, is it not dawned on him yet that there's a problem? He's casually drinking a Coke when he's encountered by a Dallas police officer. We also know that the Warren Commission discounted testimony about men fleeing the building immediately afterwards. Men who met the description of those who saw men in the 6th floor windows. A man with a brown coat and horn-rimmed glasses. That's Malcolm Wallace.
Yes, yes. You know, this is just fascinating, and I strongly urge everyone to kind of pick up this book and read it, because you've done a fascinating job with this. I have to ask, you know, given your history, you know, in politics and you know, the friends you've made, the enemies you've made, and all of that, what has been their reaction to you writing this book?
It's been mixed. I mean, I'm a free spirit. You know, I guess I started as a Goldwater Republican. I really believe in small government. I really believe in privacy. I really believe in the rights of the individual. And I've been right in the middle of right-wing American politics for 30, 40 years. I've seen some amazing things, and therefore I think that I'm a realist. In other words, my book is not a love letter for anybody. I'm very critical of Lyndon Johnson and the Kennedys. I'm also very critical of Richard Nixon, who I worked for.
You worked for, yeah.
You know, this is kind of a warts and all book by somebody who was there, and I'm a realist. I have soured on the two-party duopoly, sadly. The Republican Party, that was traditionally the small government party, has morphed into a big government party.
Yes.
Both parties are for the Patriot Act. Both parties are for government spying. Neither party will balance the federal budget. Both parties are deeply committed to more spending and more taxes and more interference in the private lives of Americans. Both parties seem committed to running off to foreign wars where the best interests of the United States are just not clear. That doesn't mean there aren't some good Republicans. For me, there are. There are people who are fighting within the party, but it's why I became a member of the Libertarian Party and why I voted for Governor Gary Johnson, who was on the ballot in 48 states, but still managed to be totally ignored by the mainstream media.
You worked for Gary Johnson's campaign and fought very hard to get him elected. You know, how hard was it to get him recognized by the national media and get him out there so voters could see his views and find a third party as opposed to just the two-party dictatorship?
It was extremely frustrating. First of all, Gary Johnson was an eminently qualified candidate. You got a very successful two-term governor in New Mexico, somebody who cut taxes, cut spending, balanced the budget, and created more jobs than any other governor in the country during that period of time. So no one could argue that he was a fringe candidate or he was a symbolic candidate. He was fully qualified to be president of the United States. He got on the ballot in 48 states, which is a difficult, time-consuming, expensive process. But he theoretically could have won 270 electoral votes. So I don't know how you justified keeping him out of the debates. The Presidential Commission on Debates is not appointed by the president. It's not a commission, and it's certainly not about open debate.
Right.
So it was very frustrating because we were, at the one hand, we're looking at all these polls telling us that 68, 69% of the people unhappy with their choices. I wish there was another candidate. Well, there was. They just didn't know about it.
You know, it's interesting when we referenced earlier this kind of coup d'etat that took place on November 22nd. In your time in Washington and in politics, did you feel the repercussions of that coup d'etat?
Sure.
Of that kind of, seeping, kind of creeping energy that took place?
I think it's the second coup d'etat we had.
Really?
A terrific piece written by Jesse Ventura and Dick Russell. Connects the dots between the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, and Watergate. Richard Nixon was brought down because he was attempting to get the CIA records that proved their involvement in the JFK assassination. Why? Because he wanted it for leverage.
Right.
He wanted it for leverage against being removed himself. So I believe the Watergate break-in was dreamed up by G. Gordon Liddy and Jeb Stuart Magruder and John W. Dean, who pushed it more than anyone else. But once they recruited James McCord, a CIA agent, he briefed the agency, and they decided here was their opportunity to bring down Nixon, who was threatening the Central Intelligence Agency, the same way JFK was, ironically. So I think he undid himself, but not without sabotage from the agency.
And then right there, now you have, now that's a clear message to the two parties. We'll take out Kennedy, and we'll take out, Nixon. We'll take out Democrat and we'll take out Republicans. So don't try to play any games with us.
The military-industrial complex is not ideological. They're about money and power. They're neither right nor left. They will invent a candidate on the right and left if they need one. So people were upset about George W. Bush, so they created Barack Obama, who's fully unqualified to be president of the United States, who served in the state Senate and the U.S. Senate, but has written 2 biographies, but no major legislation of any kind. So the military-industrial complex, the American media establishment, they can go right or left depending on what's required at the time.
What's required at the time, and coming out of it makes sense, because coming out of the Bush presidency with Cheney and all of that, we're feeling very constricted. We're feeling very down. We need to get a new champion of the people. So let's get this guy.
Plus, they take advantage of the democratic change. We have more and more minority voters, so maybe it was time for the first minority president. Being black was not a detriment to his candidacy. It was an asset to his candidacy.
Yeah, it was groundbreaking.
Just like Kennedy's being Catholic was a benefit, not a drawback. In fact, Bobby Kennedy had millions of pieces of violently anti-Catholic literature attacking John Kennedy printed. He put Hubert Humphrey's name on it, and he mailed it to the voters in West Virginia. All the Catholic households only.
Wow.
Being Catholic was an asset for him, not a liability.
Well, it's interesting when we were talking about Bush too. Is that I'd read that you were involved with the 2000 election and what happened there. Could you get into that a little bit, because a lot of people have said that a lot of people obviously still disagree with what happened with that.
Sure.
And they feel that the Supreme Court acted wrong in terms of electing a president or saying this is who should be president, because technically it's supposed to go to the Congress and let them vote. What was your experience with that, and how do you feel about that today?
I did not work on George W. Bush's campaign. When I worked for the Reagan White House, when I worked for the Reagan campaigns, I became very friendly with Jim Baker, James A. Baker III, the White House Chief of Staff. In 1981, I was running the campaign of Tom Kean for governor of New Jersey. It was very close. It was an off-year election. It was very, very close. I went to Baker and I asked Baker to persuade the president to visit New Jersey. At the very last minute he did. We won by 1,200 votes.
Wow, very good.
Out of 2.5 million.
Very good.
So in my business, I was a man who owed a debt. I had a chit. So when Jim Baker called me and said, I need you to go to Florida and work on this recount, I was in no position as a political professional to say no, even though George W. Bush and his father were never my cup of tea. And also, everything is relative. I never thought Al Gore would be a great president. So I went down there, and in Miami-Dade County, the Democrats were seeking to recount the same ballots a third time. So people say, Stone closed down the recount. No, I closed down an attempt to recount the same ballots 3 times when there had been no change. And the so-called Brooks Brothers riot happened when 2 Democrats took a sheaf of ballots and tried to go behind closed doors into a room with no windows, no doors, and no neutral observers, in violation of the state's sunshine law. So that obviously caused a disruption. I think it is impossible to know who actually won the election, and therefore the Supreme Court's decision made a decision for us, because Al Gore made a fundamental mistake in not requiring a recount in every Florida county. He played politics too, and he only chose to recount in those counties where he thought he would gain votes. He was afraid to count in other counties, and I think that mistake really cost him the presidency more than anything else.
More than anything else. Do you feel that there was an element, when you look at kind of the direction the country went in after Bush, a lot of conspiracy theorists will look at that, kind of what happened there, and then look at like today and where we're at as a country and say, we needed to have Bush come in to kind of push the project for the new American century and get all of those guys in. Brings about 9/11, brings about the security state that we're in. Did you ever get wind, or did you feel that there was kind of a hidden hand there?
I am not that conspiracy minded. I think that George W. Bush and his main handler Karl Rove correctly recognized there was an opportunity, because people had Clinton fatigue, and they were sick of the Clinton abuses, and 8 years of Bill Clinton created a political opportunity. The Bush name was still a good name from his father's presidency. His father has this kind of goofy, almost likable, persona, which shouldn't kid you. He is a very competitive, very disciplined, very ambitious technocrat who believed in power and crony capitalism and money. He had no ideology at all. He could be a moderate Republican, he could be a conservative Republican, he could be a Rockefeller Republican, he could be a Goldwater Republican.
Well, he came out of the CIA at the
Right.
end of the day. He's
So-
following the kind of...
Right. So he could be whatever he needed to be politically. He tried to run for the U.S. Senate twice in Texas, was defeated both times. The first time he ran as a right-winger. The second time he ran as a moderate Republican. Didn't work either way. So I'm not quite as conspiratorial about it, but I would have to admit to you, and I've written a piece to this extent, that I might not have worked on the recount if I had known we were going to Afghanistan.
Right.
Or pardon me, if I'd known we were going to Iraq. I still don't understand why we were in Iraq.
Makes no
if it
logic.
wasn't about oil and money, because it certainly wasn't about democracy.
No.
It had, you know, if it was about democracy, when are the Saudis having their election? When is that?
Exactly. You know, where do you see our country headed? You know, from the research you've done with JFK and like all of your years in politics, where do you see us going?
I wish I could be more optimistic. I think the biggest problem we have in America today is that we have more takers than we have producers. So the government's going to turn around and buy the votes with our own tax money, whether it is I'll give you free health care, or I'll give you a college scholarship, or I'll give you a bigger welfare payment, or I'll give you a cell phone for votes. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. I also think that the country is changing demographically, so that a majority in California and Texas, for example, would be Hispanic. And therefore, for the Republicans, if they don't find a way to appeal to those voters, they're going to go the way of the Whigs. And I could see a complete upheaval. But my experience with the book has been educational, because the cover-up continues. The New York Times won't cover this book. The Washington Post won't cover this book. Huffington Post, a very good friend of mine, Christian Josie, who was a columnist for them, been at the Huffington Post from the very beginning, has never had anything he wrote turned down or even edited. Wrote a piece on this book, an excellent piece, and they spiked it. I was supposed to be on CNN last night. Fully scheduled. They even bought me a transportation. They bought me train tickets to D.C. At the last minute, the chairman of CNN, Chair Emeritus Tom Johnson, a member of the LBJ Library Board, an LBJ sycophant, pressures them to spike the segment. So the cover-up continues even today, and the good news is that shows like this allow us to get the truth out.
Do you feel that something like a Kennedy assassination and that kind of coup d'etat, do you feel that that could happen again?
I think it'd be much, much tougher because of the internet, because of our ability to share information quickly. And therefore it'd be much harder for the government to stage a cover-up. The information flow in 1963, like I say, was so limited that if you had all three networks, you kind of had it. So for example, the famous piece of videotape, which in the last week you've seen 100 times, of Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
You know, the president died at 1:33 today, some 40 minutes ago.
Yes, yeah.
And then he goes on to say, Vice President Johnson will take the oath of office, which will make him the President of the United States. That's completely false. Under our Constitution, when the president dies, the vice president is automatically elevated. There's no oath necessary. So the famous picture of Johnson taking the oath, that was strictly symbolic. That was power grabbing. And we now know that Lyndon Johnson called Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department. The Attorney General says, hey, Bobby, read me the oath.
That's right.
He's just sticking the knife in to twist it. That's all that was.
Wow. Well, just to finish up, what do you feel have been your greatest accomplishments in politics?
Ronald Reagan was an anti-establishment figure of his time. People lose sight of this now, but the smart money, the establishment money, was with Big John Connolly and George W. Bush. So Reagan was from the West Coast. He was a Westerner. He was a cowboy movie actor. He was another Goldwater, and so on. I do think that he made some fundamental changes. Was he perfect? No. Spending continued to rise under Reagan. He was not perfect, but one of the themes of my book is that none of our political leaders are perfect.
And we need to wake up to that. I think as a country, we need to stop buying that media thing of just that they're perfect and they should be perfect.
Right,
and,
right. So I would have to say my involvement with Reagan is the thing that I am proudest of. But after that, I would have to point you to this book because this is 10 years in the writing and 30 years in the concept. Since 1964, I began to realize that Lyndon Johnson is a serial murderer. Lyndon Johnson could order a murder the way you and I would order a ham sandwich. This is someone who is intrinsically evil, devious, duplicitous, drunk. This is not somebody who ever should have been president of the United States. And he delivered millions in war profits to his friends in the military-industrial complex, to his friends in the defense contracting industry. So had Kennedy lived, I think we would have ended the war in Vietnam. I think we would have normalized relationships with Cuba. I think that we would have had a very different history. I think Johnson and his cronies in the establishment changed the direction of history through this coup d'etat.
Well, that and with the killings of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And
I'm convinced that the same people who killed John Kennedy killed Robert Kennedy, and I think in Northern California, only days before his murder, he said to a student group that he would reopen the investigation to his brother's death. That had to send chills up the spine of the CIA and their associates in the mob. I mean, we know that the CIA never told the Warren Commission we've been working with organized crime to assassinate Castro.
No.
The FBI never told the Warren Commission that yes, Lee Harvey Oswald had been a paid informant, that Jack Ruby had been a paid informant. So Oswald goes to New Orleans. He gets into a fist fight while he's handing out pro-Castro. He gets arrested. They take him to jail. He has one phone call. Who does he call? His wife? His lawyer? No, he calls the head of the FBI in New Orleans. And an hour and a half later, he's out on the street and the charges are dropped.
Yeah. No, I think clearly anyone looking at it knows that Lee Harvey Oswald had intelligence hands written all over him.
Well, what's interesting is that the government has concluded that. In other words, it's not
the House Select Committee on Assassination.
Well, let's start with the subcommittee of the Church Committee, chaired by Senator Richard Schweiker, a very close friend of mine. Yeah. They established that Oswald is an asset of the CIA. Robert Plumlee has now said that, a former CIA official. Victor Marchetti confirms it. We know that Anthony Venciana says that he met his CIA handler, David Atlee Phillips, in the lobby of a Dallas office building, and he saw him with Lee Harvey Oswald. So for the FBI and the CIA to deny knowledge of Oswald to the Warren Commission means that nothing else they told the Warren Commission can be believed.
What is up next for you?
I think I am going to write a book on the Clintons.
Really?
Yes, I think that there's a major expose there. I think that is also very much like this. It's a story that involves power, intrigue, sex, and murder. I think that's next.
That's interesting. Well, keep us posted on what happens with that book. Thank you very much for joining us today, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Tyrell Ventura with a fascinating edition of Buzzsaw. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.